Today we explore the systematic unmaking of Africa, slavery to colonization. Before chains, before borders, before foreign flags were planted in African soil, Africa governed itself. This episode explores not only what was done to Africa, but what was deliberately undone. Africa was targeted for large-scale enslavement because geography, economics, politics, and racism converged at the same time. Africans were resilient and highly skilled, masters of metallurgy, agriculture, medicine, navigation, and organized trade. Yet they could be forcibly isolated through ocean crossings, severed from their homelands and support systems. Slavery was never about labor alone. It was about the extraction of knowledge, systems, and human capital. Once slavery proved profitable, it became self-reinforcing. Enslaved Africans were reduced to capital. Plantations generated enormous wealth, and those profits financed ships, weapons, and wars, expanding the very system that enslaved them. Early slavery was not originally race-based. As millions of Africans were enslaved, Europeans constructed racial ideologies. Blackness was falsely linked to inferiority. Christianity, science, and law were twisted to justify enslavement. Racism became a tool to legitimize violence. The enslavement of Africans lasted over 1,300 years, moving people through the Trans-Saharan, Red Sea, Indian Ocean, and transatlantic trades. It is estimated that over 20 to 25 million Africans were forcibly removed. In the transatlantic slave trade, estimates suggest millions died in the brutal Middle Passage, approximately 2.5 million during the voyage alone, plus millions more from slave raids, wars, and seasoning camps, with total deaths in the transatlantic slave trade potentially reaching 15 to 20% of those captured. This immense loss of life highlights the extreme brutality and devastating human cost of the transatlantic slave trade. When slavery became politically inconvenient, Europe did not withdraw. It changed tactics. By the late 1800s, Europe needed raw materials. New factories required cheap labor. Control of land became more valuable than people. The solution was colonization. Africa would no longer be exported. It would be occupied. Contrary to colonial myth, Africa was not lawless or stagnant. Before colonization, Africa had centralized states like Mali, Songhai, Ethiopia, federated systems like Igbo, Akan, Oromo, trade economies linked to global markets, judicial systems based on law, not force. African societies were diverse, but they were functional. Colonization did not bring order. It replaced African systems with foreign control. In 1884 to 1885, European powers gathered in Berlin. Not one African was invited. In a single conference, Africa was partitioned into colonies. Borders were drawn with rulers. Ethnic groups were split. Rival communities were forced together. This was not diplomacy. It was corporate land theft on a continental scale. African books and cultural heritage were actively destroyed, burned, and suppressed during colonial periods and by later authoritarian regimes in Africa, like apartheid South Africa. Colonizers sought to erase indigenous knowledge, control narratives, and assert cultural dominance, with examples including the burning of Timbuktu manuscripts and systematic destruction of colonial records to erase evidence of colonial crimes and administration. Colonial rule was not abstract. It meant forced labor, hut taxes payable only in colonial currency, land seizures, racial laws, beatings, imprisonment, execution. Africans were ruled without consent, punished without trial, and taxed without representation. Colonialism was violence disguised as administration. During colonization, Africans faced brutal exploitation, including forced labor for European economic gain, land seizure, disruption of societies, cultural suppression, devaluing traditions, languages, and political fragmentation through arbitrary borders, leading to economic dependency, loss of identity, social instability, and long-term underdevelopment, all while enduring violence and disease introduced by settlers. Africans were compelled to work for Europeans on plantations, mines, to pay new taxes that demanded cash, destroying traditional subsistence economies. Colonies became sources of raw materials for European industries, with economic systems designed for the colonizers' benefit. Land was taken for European settlement, forcing Africans onto reserves in dry regions or into labor roles on white-owned farms. Colonial powers exploited existing ethnic differences or created new ones, fostering conflict and undermining unity. For example, In Cameroon, the divide-and-rule tactics implemented by the colonizers exacerbated ethnic and clan loyalties, leading to lasting linguistic, cultural, and political tensions, notably the ongoing Anglophone crisis, which stems from this artificial separation and unequal development. Traditional customs, languages, and beliefs were suppressed, eroding cultural heritage and identity. Borders drawn by Europeans grouped rival peoples together and split coherent communities, sowing seeds for future conflict. One such example are the institutionalized divisions between Hutu and Tutsi, which resulted in genocide in Rwanda. Under the guise of a humanitarian mission, King Leopold II claimed the Congo Free State as his personal property in 1885. His true aim was the ruthless extraction of ivory and rubber. To maximize profits, his force publique enforced a regime of terror, utilizing forced labor, village burnings, and the systematic mutilation of workers, most notably the severing of hands, to meet strict production quotas. Women and children were taken as hostages. To force Congolese men were forced into the jungle to harvest wild rubber. While Leopold amassed a staggering fortune in Europe, he left behind generational echoes of oppression. The human cost of this exploitation was staggering. Historians estimate that 10 million lives were lost between 1885 and 1908 due to mass murder, exhaustion, and disease. This systematic unmaking reduced the Congo's population by nearly half, transforming a sovereign land into a private labor camp and leaving a legacy of trauma that persists over a century later. Imposed structures created lasting political instability and fragmentation after independence, contributing to civil wars. Pre-colonial economic systems were dismantled, leading to long-term economic dependency and reduced African per capita income. Africans did not accept colonization quietly. Resistance was widespread, diverse, and fierce, involving armed revolts, diplomatic maneuvering, economic protests, and cultural preservation. Emperor Menelik II's forces decisively defeated invading Italian troops. Samori Toure's Wars, West Africa, the Maji Maji Rebellion, Tanzania, the Chimurenga Wars, Zimbabwe, Kabalega and Mwanga Resistance in Uganda, the Herero and Nama Resistance, Namibia, Mau Mau Uprising, Kenya, Chilembwe Rebellion, Nyasaland, Malawi, Voltabani Resistance, Burkina Faso. There were countless local uprisings erased from textbooks. Formal colonization lasted roughly 70 to 100 years, but its effects were engineered to last far longer. Only Ethiopia and Liberia avoided full colonization. Liberia was established for freed Black Americans, founded by the American Colonization Society. It became Africa's first republic in 1847, avoiding European colonial rule. Ethiopia maintained independence through military strength, notably defeating Italy at the Battle of Adwa in 1896. By 1960, over 50 African countries had been colonized. Nearly 90% of Africans lived under foreign rule at its peak. Independence came, but not always freedom. Africa regained independence through armed struggle, mass protest, negotiated withdrawal, and the powerful force of Pan-African solidarity. Freedom was fought for, not gifted. Africa regained flags. But did it regain control? Colonial economies were left intact. Borders remained unchanged. Foreign interests still shaped African markets. This raises an uncomfortable question. Was independence the end of colonization, or merely its rebranding? To understand Africa today, we must confront how it was systematically unmade. History is not the past. It is the foundation we are still standing on. And when millions were taken from this continent, they did not disappear. They carried Alkebulan with them. Subscribe to continue the journey with us in the next episode, as we follow the scattered children of Alkebulan, tracing where enslaved African peoples were taken, what they endured, and how Alkebulan survived in language, rhythm, faith, and blood. Because even when Alkebulan was broken apart, it was impossible to erase.